So I just recorded a little reel for my Instagram, which you might want to check out on the topic of some of the latest AI clones that people are using in like digital marketing where, the AI clone is like trained to like sound just like you. And, let me know what you think about the reel that I posted. And I just wanted to kind of like expand a little bit on that here because I've become aware that more and more people aren't exactly aware of like the consequences and the stakes involved with the paradigm at work. Like they may question some of the things that I've said, like, oh, well, what's wrong with like using this? It's just another tool. Like I'm just like playing with this or so on. So I encourage you to listen to that reel that I am going to post for a lot of the details where I just spoke about that. But the key, like what's at root with this problem, and it's actually a predicament because a lot of the trajectory of the way that AI has been deployed, or specifically, let's just talk about the large language models that are at the basis of generative AI. A lot of this rollout has been completely within the materialist paradigm of technological development that we've been used to for like the last, well, 30 but 150 years. And there's probably a few different categories that we could use to discuss this technological paradigm, but for my purposes, for like what's really at stake here, a large part of this is the externalization that they engender, which is another way of talking about the alienation of human capabilities, human potential, and opportunities for your spiritual development. Now, right away, that might not make sense to you if you're already coming from a completely materialist paradigm where you actually think that the only thing that your mind is like neuronal chemistry. The fundamental hallmark or sign of spiritual loss and kind of like spiritual atrophy is the complete externalization of your potential or your potential for development. So, for example, there's a high profile, um, he's not a scholar of AI per se, but he's, I guess, you can call him an AI entrepreneur actually now because he's developing his own apps and selling them. And he's promoting this idea that we as a human collective will need to depend on AI so that we don't enter into kind of civilizational collapse. That we need to give that power over to these large AI systems so that we don't invoke existential collapse of one form or another. So, this is actually the opposite of what most the original developers and designers and researchers on these neural networks and on the like capabilities of generative AI. This is the opposite of what many of them are saying. Like ethics 101 goes back to the idea that just because you can doesn't mean you ought to. Like you need to think through all of the consequences, not just for yourself, but for others as well. And the consequences of what the stakes are if everyone were to take the same exact action that you're hoping to take for yourself. And I just feel that the way that LLMs were deployed and just rolled out the way they were prior to any kind of regulation, prior to any kind of real public education about what was about to happen, was kind of fundamentally irresponsible in the same way that we understand now when we look back on what was known already in the 1970s and what big oil companies chose to do instead. Just to take a little bit of a hyperbolic example, imagine someone developed like a neurotoxin and then found a way to distribute it freely amongst the population, disguised as something else because one of the side effects is that it has some beneficial features if you kind of like squint your eye and look in a certain direction. And then 6 months later starting to come out with your book and all these other public ops where you're basically warning people about the existential dangers and the financial collapse coming because of like what you introduced. And so I really see that maybe there's like three broad groups of people or opinions so far in this area. The first being which are just the instant adopters, you know, like if the neural chip was available tomorrow, they'd just be lining up at 4 a.m. for it. And then, you know, people who have like high intuition, high kind of a priori reasoning. You can watch another video that I made on this about 6 months ago or so. And, you know, who can already like see how some of the consequences combine to produce like new levels of stakes that weren't like in the original agreement, kind of like those teaser mortgages that caused the financial collapse in 2008. I was still a little bit too young to have heard some of the earlier criticisms, but I'm pretty sure that people were already warning about that before like the CDOs were even rolled out, that kind of thing. And then I think the majority of people are in this kind of like hazy middle area, like of the bell curve, where they kind of understand what these models are and what the consequences are, but they're also just really happy that they can like, you know, manipulate their face and this is a cool tool and like look at what I can do now. Like a kind of like gee whiz, you know, kind of wow, this is really helping with like I was a bad writer to begin with, like I hated it, and like so now this will just like write for me, like it will like save me time. Or like I don't want to have to talk to people all day long. I don't want to have to talk to all my customers. I want to like create an automated clone so that, like I don't have to actually deal with any of that. And then right, I mean, like where was everyone before, you know, with all of the criticisms that we've had and we've felt about like corporate environments and creating like such distance, such impersonal layers between people and the corporation and bureaucracy, because like make no mistake, like this is the same paradigm. This is going to like continue to add layers of distance and layers of friction, counterintuitively, because everyone likes to imagine the digital as being, maybe because it seems invisible, because it seems virtual, like people imagine it as having like no friction whatsoever, but that's like the biggest fleecing ever. You can see already, as I spoke in another video, like even within the traditional job market search at this point, like if you've been involved in this, you are very familiar with the types of friction that automated AI systems have already introduced. And what an AI based, data driven system will entail is that these are just more points for control. Because once something is in the form of a data point, if your app or service is connecting to any other app or services, by definition, you no longer have control of that data. It's no longer yours. So, this whole fantasy about technology becoming like seamless and, you know, without boundaries, it's all about erasing boundaries or just ignoring your own boundaries to begin with. For example, the former Google CEO Eric Schmidt is now on about like how we're headed towards no more interfaces, right? Like that's passe. Wow, that's like so, that's just like Stone Age, right? Interfaces. This is part of the whole paradigm of like trying to imagine this kind of like seamless experience. That's the ideology. That's what the Trojan horse is that they're going to sell you, because it's never going to work like that. You are going to encounter like more points of friction, which are more points of control, which is about externalizing who you are or your ability to access what you would need to like develop who you are. Oh, Shannon, that sounds so extreme. You're talking so vague and abstract that doesn't really even make any sense. No, it's not vague and abstract. I'm like creating like a summary, a really quick summary overview, intuitive overview of exactly what's going to happen. Not in a predictive sense, but just in terms of this is the underlying pattern that's already in place. This is not the future. I mean, again, those who already get this will get this. And I guess the question just is, because we're ahead of the curve, and a lot of people are just never going to get this. And that's fine. We can just say, like, well, we can just accept that. Except insofar as on a social collective level, it creates conditions where the technology becomes even more coercive. And I guess what our role is here for the people who already get this, who understand that this is not vague talk, but understand why these are the patterns and trajectories that are currently in place. So this is not about like trying to predict like something collapsing by mid 2026 or something like that. But what we really have to do is imagine a way to develop collectively and socially in ways where we can obviously like have more control over our own data, but to understand that data already is a reduction. It's always already missing something. Like we are not data. That's not the ontological currency at all. And once something is in the form of data, which is a digital format, whether it's unstructured or structured, whatever have you, that is like the essence of externalization. That's the essence of alienation. Information is already a reduction of experience, to quote Jaron Lanier. And from the point of view of integration, which is arguably at the core of your own higher development, whether you want to call that spiritual or not, externalization is exactly what you want to avoid because it's going to prohibit integration. And arguably, one of the reasons we don't have good intuitions about time anymore is because of the depth and extent to which it has been externalized as a social system, which is not to say like it hasn't been useful, like it helped us coordinate, like steam engine deliveries and all of that historically. But from the point of view of consciousness, it was like a massive externalization, and that's arguably why we don't have any good intuitions of time, despite the fact that temporality is arguably like the form of our inner consciousness. And so, how do you think all of these interfaceless computing experiences will contribute further to that trajectory, especially when they're linked with people's neurological systems, which already, obviously, our neurological systems are engaged in certain ways and to a certain extent just by virtue of like the ways we're already interacting with technology. But once it's inside your biology, once it's inside like your brain, the blood brain barrier, there's a real difference. Like one major difference that no one's talked about yet is that you definitely won't have ownership over the implant. Like you won't own that technology, but it's inside you. And the difference there with something like, for example, certain medicines, for example, certain substances or pharmaceuticals, is the way in which these kinds of implants will be digital technologies that will be linked with external networks and likely increasingly agentic networks that you definitely not only won't have control over or even access to, let alone even many people will have the ability to understand them. So I'm just going to wrap this up here because like I think I've made my point, but I would love to connect with others who are already on this wavelength, who already get it, because we need to be more specific about this, right? When we talk about AI, I'm not talking about little macros in your word processing program or whether or not you're like using Grammarly. I'm talking about the generative agentic networks that will develop autonomously and are through coercive means are being groomed to like access your apps on your behalf, access your data, and then with people getting their implants, like well let's just access your implant on your own behalf. I mean, think about it. And a lot of these developers and self declared visionaries even think like they're doing a really good job and thinking that this is in service to humanity, but it's because they're like locked within this materialist paradigm, this materialist dogma that they assume or they are unaware has been falsified. And then there's a smaller percentage still who know the truth about that, but are playing the other side anyway. And I've mentioned a little bit about this before in one of my videos, I think, or it might have been an article. I should say more about that. But it's very high level and it's very very much about another register on which certain agents are attempting to retain power. Let's just say that to keep it simple. So, yeah, I'd like to hear from you where you're standing with your own understanding on a lot of these issues right now. And yeah, thank you for watching, and I'll be talking about this more. I am writing about this, so look out soon, because I may be releasing like a short book. And yeah, we'll keep talking. Thanks.